Hello, good evening, welcome. Tonight on the David Ellis Report, we're speaking to Admiral Lord West, former head of the Royal Navy and Security Minister under the Gordon Brown government. As Rolls-Royce has announced that it will be cutting UK jobs by taking the jet engine fan blade production to Singapore, which is ironic because that's the whole reason I got involved with lobbying against defence cuts in the first place when Rolls-Royce closed their factory at Anstey in Coventry as a result of the 2010 Defence Review. Admiral Lord West, what a pleasure to have
Yeah,
you
I
on.
mean, I think it was. We had questions in the House of Lords on this issue earlier this week. I mean, the bottom line is, at the time when Mandelson was the Secretary of State, money was being given to Rolls-Royce, and they were encouraged to, and they wanted to send British people out to teach the Singaporeans how to make turbine blades. The basis for that being done was that they would not take any jobs away from East Lancashire, from the plant there. Now, admittedly, that was some years ago. Clearly, Rolls-Royce have got real problems. I think they made a loss in the last quarter of 1.7 billion, 1.2 billion of which was to do with the huge fall in aerospace. You know, aviation is in a catastrophic state because of COVID.
Yeah.
But yes, all right, it was a real problem for them. But clearly, they've reneged on their agreement about not sending work to Singapore and thereby losing British jobs. So a plant that was 2,000 strong, 1,000 have been lost over a period of time, and now another 750 are going to go. And it's absolutely catastrophic for the plant up there. And of course, these are highly skilled jobs, just the sort of thing we need to keep in the UK. So not at all happy about that. And we need to be very clear. There are certain things that we need to be able to keep and do onshore in this country.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, it's a key component annexed immediately to defence industry and defence industry production. So it's not that's something that needs to be addressed rapidly. It's
Well, I mean,
a
I think the other key issue is, I mean, Rolls-Royce, 30% of its turnover comes from defence things. A lot of those nuclear reactors, things like that.
yeah.
They're very good at green type power generation, and I have no doubt that because of the shambles in our nuclear power industry at the moment, because it is a bit of a shambles. You know, the Japanese have pulled out of the two plants they were going to build in Wales. You know, the Hinkley C is plodding on, but it's expensive. You know, where will we build the other ones? Will they happen? What we need to do, I believe, is go for these sort of small nuclear reactors. And Rolls-Royce are good at doing that because they've got experience of building nuclear reactors for the Royal
Royal
Navy.
Navy.
Now, to do that, they will want government money. If the government's going to give them money and push it, they've jolly well got to ensure that the jobs are kept onshore here and not pushed away, say, into the States or something. You know, they need to be done here. If the government are giving them money, it should be UK high-skilled workers who do it.
Absolutely. And that's something that MPs need to get behind, and that's regardless of whatever party they are. That's across as a national.
Absolutely, it should be a cross-party issue, that.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. So
It's
we're going to.
sovereign capability, apart from anything else. We need the ability within our country to do certain things. You know, one of the ones I think is build nuclear submarines, build warships, build fast jets, these things, and we need to make sure we can do those things.
Yes, absolutely, and that's something that fundamental here with the Japanese, because Hitachi, don't they make the pressure vessels for the reactors? Is that correct?
I'd have to check to be sure, but certainly what's interesting is we led the world on civil nuclear power. Successive governments threw that away. I mean, it's typical of our country, I'm afraid. It's appalling. The biggest export we used to have to Japan some 30 years ago was nuclear and
Yeah.
nuclear advice and nuclear parts. Now we're relying on Japan to actually build nuclear power stations here, and the Chinese to do the same, and the French to do the same. And I think that's a pretty dreadful state of affairs.
It's an absolutely dreadful state of affairs. It's very similar to sort of how we led the way with aircraft production in the early 50s, isn't it? That we blazed a trail with revolutionary production, blazed a trail sort of elsewhere in engineering, and then we found this repeat pattern. I think it's probably something that Mark Francois said in Defence Committee, didn't he? That we've had all these reviews and we still haven't learned. So on that sort of note, where we're coming in from the industrial sort of angle, with the new production of the Fleet Auxiliary and the new production of T-31 warships, how are you sort of seeing that progress at your end in the Lords?
Well, I think the very interesting development is that the Secretary of State for Defence said that the Fleet Solid Support ships are warships. Now, warships should be built on shore. So, whereas there was a real push to try and get these things built abroad, I believe now they will build them on shore. When they build them on shore, whether that's, I think it'll probably be some Brit consortium, maybe with a foreign consortium involved, but they need to be built here. And that has to make sense. When you build things abroad, the company that's building them doesn't pay any tax. The workers who are building it for that company don't pay any tax. You lose jobs in the UK, so you have to retrain people and people go on the dole. The total cost is more expensive than actually if you built them in this country. Everyone thinks it's nice and cheap. Well, it's cheap to the MOD because the other things doesn't affect them. Tax, retraining, skills. The MOD say, "Oh, this is nice and cheap. It helps them. It doesn't help UK Limited." So I'm very glad they're likely to be built on shore. We need to get this order in. They should have been ordered 3 years ago. It's gone round and round in circles, this order, and we need to crack on with it.
Indeed we do. Well, it may well be good for the MOD, but taking a leaf out of Nick Carter's book about breaking down silos, there's a silo there immediately that you've highlighted where they've got to differentiate between the good of the nation and a project of this undertaking and what's good for the MOD balance sheet. And they're two very specific things. So on that basis, I mean, we sort of saw a notion that with the T-31s that they wanted to go on a pan-EU type gambit to build them with Krupps. Well, of course, we're in the danger then of repeating what we had with the Pan-Avia aviation and the Tornado, that we've stripped out, exactly as you've just said, that industrial diversity, the engineering and the capability in Britain, where that's been stripped away. We no longer make an aircraft, and I would hate to see that we have a situation where we don't or cannot make a warship.
Well, I think the Type 31s are interesting. People talk about them as the Asda frigate or Little frigate or whatever it is. I think that's a bit unfair. I'm very happy to get more hulls, and they're capable enough for quite a lot of jobs.
Yes.
Babcock are going to be building them. There's 5 have been ordered. I think we mustn't kid ourselves about the cost. I mean, it's good they're going for, say, 250 million. That's without the weapons, though.
Yeah.
And the weapons are expensive. So comparing 250 million for a hull with the cost of a Type 26 of 1.1 billion, which is way too expensive, but actually has all the weapons, is not really a very fair comparison.
That's right.
And we need to order more than 5 because SMEs need rolling programs so that they can build things and run viable concerns. So we need to build more than 5 of them. As I say, they're going to be built by Babcock up in Rosyth. We need, I believe, to order the next 5 Type 26s. Of the 8, only 3 have been ordered. Why haven't we ordered the other 5? Why are we letting BAE Systems take so long to produce the first one? The first one will have taken about 10 years from cutting steel to actually being an operational frigate. It's bloody ridiculous. We build the aircraft carriers quicker than that.
That's not a viable timescale. There's 2 aspects to that. One is the production timescale. Now this is an old lesson because Jellicoe mentioned this in his Grand Fleet book. It was a key area, was the production timescale and the costs of actually making things quickly and cheaply and getting them out to sea. So that timescale that they're talking about there for those is not viable. And the second point, and you've highlighted this at committee, is that steady drumbeat that these businesses need to produce these things efficiently. And those numbers and that timescale are not viable for any of those kind of gambits that we want to be working on.
And I think the thing is, those frigates plus the Fleet Solid Support ships, that's why we need the Fleet Solid Support ships here. There is a government shipbuilding strategy, apparently. That shipbuilding strategy means you need ships. You can't have a shipbuilding strategy unless you order ships. It's self-evident, isn't it, really?
Yeah, correct.
And therefore, they've got to be doing that. And at the moment, there are not enough ship orders. And the Secretary of State for Defence is I hate the expression, the shipbuilding Tsar. He's been made. He's the one responsible for that shipbuilding strategy. And as you say, we need a proper shipbuilding strategy. We need a run of ships, a run of frigates being produced. Now, if you do that, you can drive the costs down. You can make the company drive the cost down. And as it is with the timescales, we've got a real issue about number of frigates in our navy. I mean, we've got 13 frigates at the moment. It's a national disgrace for a maritime nation, really.
Yes.
13 frigates, 6 destroyers. That number of 13 frigates is going to almost inevitably drop. Almost inevitably. The first of the Type 31s isn't going to really appear until 2020, late 2023, operational 2024, something like that. By then, we'll have been paying off some of the Type 23s. The first of the Type 26s is coming out in 2025 or something. There is going to be a drop. We're going to end up with something like 8 frigates. I mean, it is a disaster.
It's a nonsense, and I think fundamentally, as someone, and particularly yourself, who strategically forecast in your paper as as an officer before the Falklands, you strategically forecast that because you saw the horizon, you saw the problems there at that point, and yet we're seeing a repeat of this lack of foresight within government and that looking at the horizon. I mean, that's not a tenable position for the Royal Navy to be in when we have that lag of the production and those older ships being paid off. And I think I'd probably want to bring in Lovegrove here when he made his original pitch back in when he took the job on at the MOD about saving 20 billion over 10 years from within the existing budget on efficiencies. That what worries me is that reducing those platforms is actually something that they will let happen.
Well, I can't see how they can avoid it happening. It's, I just can't see they can avoid it happening, and they won't want to run on the older ships because they cost more and more and more to do it.
Yep.
And you need the manpower for it as well, of course. And so I think it's inevitable that this will happen. And this business of efficiencies, it's a bit of a nonsense.
Yeah.
I mean, it was quite clear in the 2015 Strategic Defence Review that there was no way they'd find those efficiencies. No. And if you think that by paying off an old ship, it's an efficiency because clearly it needs lots of repair work, it's got more people, and you think, wow, that's a real efficiency, you can be so efficient you end up with no ships. And that's not really what you like. Many years ago, I remember talking to some chap who was banging on about the dockyards in those days. And basically, it was quite clear he found the ships a bloody nuisance. The dockyard could run extremely well without any ships. He didn't seem to realise the whole point of the dockyard was to support ships. And I'm afraid we got into that sort of situation, which is no good at all.
It's a nonsense, isn't it? Well, I mean, they've got to understand one fundamental, that something like the Royal Navy or the rest of the armed forces to an extent, but probably more so with the Royal Navy because of the capital investment to start with, and coming back to cardinal values here of capital investment, operational budget, is that it's already to an extent efficient and expensive, and if you cut it, it actually makes it more inefficient. And this is something that we've got to overcome in here. That these cuts, ever since the Knott Review in '81, have become almost normalised normalised politically, or they're trying to normalise them. Well, of course, it's not a position where we want to be in now, really, where we see the carriers over and over again taking flack on a cost basis. So perhaps that's an opportunity now to bring the aircraft carriers in.
Yes, I mean, the aircraft carriers are probably about one of the only really pieces of really good news that there is at the moment. There's no doubt that they're meeting all the things we wanted them to do. They're the only aircraft carriers in the world built from the keel up to take 5th generation jet aircraft. They've performed really well at sea, giving us more speed than we thought they would. They're more stable. It's very difficult to get into rough weather to see how the aircraft can perform in rough weather because you almost don't notice it. They're such good seakeepers. So they are very, very good news. Now, they cost $1 billion more than they needed to for the 2 carriers because they were delayed. Because of short-term issues about money flow, which the Treasury should never have allowed to happen, but they are always doing things like that in defence. So they cost $1 billion more than we expected. But even so, the Americans and other nations are amazed at the cost we got them built for. They're absolutely amazed, and they are now built. That is now a sunk cost. Let's forget about that. No point in banging on about it.
Yeah.
And there's so much nonsense talked about the carriers. There are a lot of people who know absolutely nothing about aircraft carrier operations keep coming up with this issue of vulnerability. I mean, probably one of the least vulnerable things at sea is a carrier battle group.
Yeah.
The only thing maybe less vulnerable is a ballistic missile submarine, which is hidden away in the depths of the ocean somewhere.
Yeah, sure.
To try and actually find the carrier, it's not easy. We are experts at actually hiding carriers. And if they find the group, they don't know where the group is. We're good at hiding dispositions. We can do that with all the improvements in satellite sensors trying to find us. We can do it in all the improvements in MCOM with all the electronics trying to find us.
Yeah.
We can do it in all the improvements in sonars because we make noises. We can make a trawler sound and look exactly like an aircraft carrier. I wouldn't want to be on that trawler because, of course, it's suddenly hit by 20 hypersonic missiles. But carriers are really, really difficult to find, and they've got huge clout. When that carrier has got its 35 35 F-35Bs on board, that is an amazing capability to be able to bash you about. Plus, they'll have the two Type 45s with them as well, plus sort of 320 in the future, 26s, probably have one or maybe two SSNs. Yes. So they can be firing off missiles that go 1,000 miles, loiter, and then go for a target either indicated by special forces or that you've preset. The plane, this has got huge capability and power. When you get someone like Dominic Cummings saying, oh, a teenager with a laptop can control drones and go and attack it and sink it, well, the man's talking complete and utter crap. I mean, basically, you can't find it. The oceans are huge, and drones drones can go huge distances if you're controlling. But you need to know where you're sending them. And they won't find it just stooging around because we are so good at hiding. And indeed, what will happen is they'll lose lots of drones. These big ones, the little drones to attack with them never find the thing anyway. So there is so much. I'm sorry, I'm sort of rather getting passionate. There is so much nonsense talked about. Carrier and carrier vulnerability. The things that are vulnerable are things like West Wittering Air Station or something. You know exactly where they are. I know exactly where that is. I can hit that with ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, and indeed, in Afghanistan, the only ones of our fixed-wing aircraft were destroyed by terrorists because they were on the ground in an airfield in Afghanistan. Aircraft carrier, no one's destroyed aircraft and aircraft. The last aircraft carrier that sunk was 1942, and they fought in every war since then pretty well. Terrorists can't get at them unless they're in harbour, of course. You don't leave them there when you've got the threat. Sure. And you can't find them, and they've got immense striking power. And so they are really, really good news for the Navy, really good news for the nation. It enables us to be an outward-looking global nation, and we need to be global. We run global shipping from London. 95% of all our stuff comes by sea. 60% of Europe's energy comes by sea, even allowing for the gas pipelines from Russia. We're the biggest investor in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Far East. That is all brilliant for our exchange, the exchange rate and things like that. It actually makes money for us. We need it to be stable. If it's not stable, then we lose out on it and we cease being as wealthy. So this is all good news. So you can see I feel very passionate about it. I'm afraid a lot of people talk nonsense about it.
I wholeheartedly agree, and on both aspects, on the industrial aspect and the Navy aspect, absolutely share your passion. And on that basis of a terrific national asset. So I'm just gonna try and sort of frame this as best as I can. That whether Her Majesty's Armed Forces, and that's Royal Navy, Marines, Army, and Air Force, to stay as a national force, as a collective within NATO, or this current gambit that we have in Europe of them wanting to form a European Defence Union. So they're two very, very different concepts, as a national force within NATO and then a fully unified force under EU command and control. Now I'm just going to overlap that with the carriers, because Angela Merkel was reported in Deutsche Welle giving a green light for the EU to have aircraft carriers. Well, that's lovely for them, but obviously they want to top out their European Defence Union in 2025, and there's no way they're going to build any in that timescale. So how do you what are they talking about, and how are they going to potentially go about that gambit?
Well, I don't know what they're intending to do, but there's a lot to unravel in what you said. The first thing I suppose to say is that without a doubt, and by a huge margin, NATO is the most important defensive alliance for our nation.
Yep.
NATO effectively ensured the security and freedom and defense of Western Europe from the Soviet Union from 1949 up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. We know now, because people like the Poles and Czechs have given us the records, that there was an intention by the Soviets to invade Western Europe, and NATO stopped that happening. The NATO effectively was America, who are without a doubt the biggest contributors, and UK.
Yeah.
I mean, the rest of Europe did not pull its weight until, well, and UK stopped pulling its weight within the last 10 years. Up till then it did.
Yes.
We spent way more than any of the others. So basically it was America and the UK with NATO that ensured the security of Western Europe. And NATO still is crucially important to us. And that link with America, let's not kid ourselves. Some people may or may not like bits and pieces about America. I've got some things I don't like about certain people, but there we are.
Sure.
But the bottom line is they are our allies, and they're a good ally to have. And my goodness me, the world is bloody lucky that the English-speaking peoples are actually together and have looked after defence in that way. They are, very lucky, and we must never forget that. Now, within Europe, the French actually are not bad about spending money on defence. They've done pretty well, but a lot of the other countries in Europe, Germany and people like that, have not been good at all. And this talk of a European defence force, I'm afraid some of it is actually to do with industrial policy.
Yes.
They want to be able to share out building work and things. All right, I can understand that. But the bottom line is you ought to have military forces you can deploy and fight with. And I'm afraid some of the European nations are not very good at that. We don't want to put lots of effort into a European defence force which builds new headquarters everywhere, apportions out where you're going to build your ships, but is incapable of actually going and fighting anyone. And I'd be very, very wary of getting too involved in that. There may be occasions, like the operations off the Horn of Africa, where European nations pull together to do it, like the business with Libya, although we couldn't have done that without the American support for the entry-type capabilities with their aircraft. So there may be the odd occasion like that where we will work with Europe. And it is absolutely correct that the safety and security of Europe is crucial for the safety and security of the UK. So we don't see Europe fall apart and disintegrate and be taken over by Russia or something.
Yes.
So there's that issue. But let's not delude ourselves that a European defence force is going to help things at the moment. There's not even enough money for the things that are really important.
Yeah. Well, that kind of I'm going to come at this now from other reports that were in Deutsche Welle about that quite a few players sort of in the German government have talked about that the nukes, British-French nuclear deterrent, must be put on the table to go into European Defence Union. Now, I found that quite worrying because obviously we're then overlapping with the special nuclear contract with America, and we're kind of almost going full circle back into that Cold War arena. And as a Cold War officer and admiral, I'm sure you've got concerns about that kind of gambit coming from Germany.
Well, I haven't been following that, I have to say, but I think I can say pretty unequivocally, there is absolutely no chance of our deterrent being run by anybody else. Whether within some sort of other union, there's absolutely no way. The Americans wouldn't have it, we wouldn't have it, and the same is absolutely true, I think, for the French. I don't think the French would do. The French would be happy, I believe, saying, "Look, we'll provide the nuclear deterrent for Europe," but they wouldn't let the other nations have control of it and run it. You wouldn't have, they wouldn't have a bunch of let's say Germans and Dutch and others in their ballistic missile submarine. There's no way they'd do that. And there's absolutely no way that our deterrent would be given to a European context. We have already allocated to NATO. It is a NATO deterrent. So we've done that. So it helps them. We know from records that were discovered after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in their attacks through Europe, the Soviets were going to use chemical, biological, and nuclear, and they were going to drop nuclear weapons on Germany, Holland, Belgium. They weren't going to drop any nuclear weapons on France or UK. Well, I wonder why that is.
It's extraordinary. I think you've hit that. This is one of the questions I've got on my list, so that's perfect because the Cold War, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, and you're obviously the, you know, with the expertise in this field. The Cold War was essentially about nuclear weapons, and those nuclear weapons were constant, even through this period when we were sold this pup, I believe, of the Cold War being over and the Soviet Union, and I'm going to say changing its position in 1989. But those nukes existed all the way through that period on both sides. So I think as a gambit to pitch for the West to be pitched under and go into these sort of defence cuts post 89 on this premium that it had finished, that the Cold War was over, was incorrect. I mean, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I think the Cold War was over. You know, the Soviet Union broke up. A lot of countries in Eastern Europe threw off that Soviet yoke, and that was all great news. The Germans managed to reunify, and I mean they did that pretty successfully. Actually, it was hugely expensive for them.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that what didn't happen is that Russia didn't become what we'd really hoped it would, was like a Western nation running in the same sort of, like a liberal democracy. It didn't, that sadly didn't really happen. It looked at one stage, it might go that way, and it didn't. And it's gone, and Putin's Russia is extremely dangerous. There's no doubt about it. It's not on the same scale and capability as the Soviet Union. And I wouldn't call it a Cold War. It's almost as if we're in a grey war now. It's going on.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's not a Cold War. It's a grey war.
Yeah.
And Putin is extremely dangerous because he's a chancer and he pushes things. And that is extremely dangerous. And he talks very glibly of the use of nuclear weapon in a war fighting context. Highly dangerous. You know, NATO doesn't see that. If you use nuclear weapons against NATO, you get a nuclear response. And the next thing you've got is mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
So it's highly dangerous, him talking that. The fact that he uses cyber to attack countries, the fact that he used, nerve agent on the soil in Britain. I mean, what an extraordinary thing. And before the days of nuclear weapons, and when we were a lot more powerful, we would have gone to war with him for that. I mean, you know, that's the reality. That is how appalling it was. In fact, we handled it well, I think, because we managed to mobilize lots of countries. And I think Putin got a surprise. Lots of his spies and things were thrown out of countries all around the West. And he was surprised about the action. He was also surprised that we were so good at handling big data that we discovered the people who'd done it really quickly. I mean, so he was completely caught out. And his security services looked complete prats. And they hate looking complete prats, the Russians. So that was a good result. But the man is extremely dangerous. Close near misses with aircraft, more nuclear submarines off the coast of UK than since the Cold War.
Yes.
He's spending money on some very, very good nuclear submarines. He's developing very nasty nuclear weapons, which is why we really mustn't let the New START treaty just fade away at the end of this year.
Sure.
You know, we've got to get the Americans and Russians talking about this.
Yeah.
He's developing hypersonic missiles. He developed very nasty, dirty torpedoes and things. I mean, he is highly dangerous. He is highly dangerous. So, yes, the Cold War's gone. The Soviet Union collapsed. That was all good news for Europe. We'd hoped Russia would become something different. It didn't. And now it's morphed into something very dangerous because of Putin and his cronies.
Yeah, well, I think you've summed that up very, very succinctly. So just sort of a complete step change now, going into a veterans issue, and you're on a platform at the Policy Exchange with General David Petraeus and Johnny Mercer as a backbench MP at the time. And something I've been involved with for quite a while was helping Dennis Hutchins and the first group of veterans that are being legally pursued decades on after these events. So you were at that meeting. What's your take on this sort of current situation with veterans being pursued in this fashion, like Dennis Hutchins?
Well, I mean, it's an absolute disgrace, and I think most people realise that. And the Conservatives, you know, I'm glad to say. I mean, I sit on the Labour benches, but I'm very glad that Conservatives put in their manifesto that they were going to do something about this. So we've now got the Overseas Operations Bill. There is no doubt there was a great groundswell within the military. You know, when going back to when I was a young officer, one sort of the contract was pretty well that if you did your very best for your nation and thought what you were doing was right, that the nation would look after you.
Yeah.
that suddenly seems to have been thrown out the window, and people were, they were looked at again and again and again.
Yeah.
Now, some of it you can argue is that the army procedures in the field were not as good as they might have been, but that's not an excuse for what happened to these people.
No.
I mean, it's disgraceful, and let's forget Northern Ireland for the moment. Just look at that, and we had the whole business of the Iraqi incidents
Yeah.
going in front of really, really bent lawyers who were trying to make money out of the whole thing. It is a disgrace. So something does and did need to be done. Now, part of the problem in terms of the European Court of Human Rights is an awful lot of the lawyers there, the ones who are not British and not French, they have got forces that have never really deployed. They don't deploy. They're not used to fighting out of their country. They cannot. They approach it as if you're sitting in your hometown, as if you're in Milton Keynes.
Yeah.
Is that how you'd behave in Milton Keynes? Well, it probably isn't quite what you do in Milton Keynes, but in Milton Keynes, you haven't got 15 seconds to decide whether some bastard's going to blow you up, shoot you, do whatever it is to you.
Yeah.
And lots of other things as well.
Absolutely.
And so I think, we need to look at that very carefully. And I think the Overseas Operations Bill going through the House at the moment is doing that. There's no doubt there are some flaws in it. There are definitely flaws in it, and it needs tweaking.
Yep.
But overall, I think it's important to try and get it done. We need to get those things tweaked, but it's more important to get it in place,
yes,
so that we can't go hounding people than the best is the enemy of the good in this case. If the bill gets thrown out because they can't get it tweaked, then that hasn't helped anyone. They haven't met their manifesto commitment. Doesn't help our people. And we need to help them. There's no doubt retired people feel very strongly about it. So this is an issue that is very emotive.
Yeah.
And as I say, the European Court of Human Rights issue is really primarily to do with judges and their ability to put themselves in that context. It's not to do with basic human rights. Our country, after all, actually effectively wrote those basic human rights that Europe works by. So, don't let them have a go at us on this,
Yeah, quite.
So
Quite.
we really do need to get this bill passed as an act, but I would like to see a number of the issues in there tweaked. It doesn't make it clear enough about issues like torture. There's the issue of what about our own people taking Mod to court for things that happen, which is, has got some of the retired veterans worried.
Yes.
We need those things to be ironed out and sorted out. But if we can't get them all sorted out, it's more important that we actually get it to become an act, so that we don't in the future have our people being chased around.